Billionaire wife was in a coma for 20 years until the new Maid'S son did the impossible. The room was silent except for the faint hum of machines. Christy Hendricks, wife of billionaire Arthur Hendricks, lay still on a large white bed inside their Manhattan townhouse. Her hair, once golden and full of life, now rested in loose strands across her shoulders. A silk blanket covered her fragile frame, and the monitors beside her kept a steady rhythm. Near the window stood Joseph, the young son of the new maid, holding a small harmonica close to his lips. He pressed a soft note into the air. To everyone's surprise, Christy's fingers moved. The nurse froze, her eyes wide, unsure if she had truly seen it. Joseph continued to play, and this time Christy's eyelids fluttered, breaking 2 decades of stillness. Was this just an accident? Or was Christy finally fighting her way back after 20 years in silence? Tell us where you're watching from, subscribe now, and don't miss tomorrow's story. Your support helps us bring you more powerful stories like this one. Christy Hendricks was known throughout New York not just as the wife of billionaire Arthur Hendricks, but as a woman who carried herself with quiet elegance. She was tall, with soft features that drew attention in any room. Her dark blue eyes often held a calm focus, and she had a warm smile that made people feel welcomed even in the most exclusive circles. Wherever she went, her sense of style followed her. Classic dresses, carefully chosen jewelry, and a graceful walk that reflected confidence. She met Arthur Hendricks during a charity fundraiser at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Arthur, already making a name as a powerful investor in real estate and technology, had been struck not by her beauty alone, but by her calm intelligence. Christy spoke about art and education with such passion that Arthur, used to conversations about numbers and contracts, felt a rare sense of connection. Their relationship grew quickly, and soon they were one of New York's most admired couples. Together, they attended galas at Lincoln Center, hosted private dinners overlooking Central Park, and spent summers in Boston where Arthur maintained strong ties with Harvard. Christy became known for her support of children's hospitals and art education programs. Unlike many public figures, she avoided unnecessary attention, preferring to work quietly, visiting schools in Queens and Newark, or funding after-school music classes. For Arthur, she was more than a partner. She was a grounding presence in a life filled with meetings, travel, and high-pressure deals. He often said Christy reminded him of what mattered beyond the numbers on his balance sheets. Their life together blended privilege with a sense of purpose, and though surrounded by wealth, they valued each other's company most. But everything changed during what should have been a simple weekend escape. On a wet spring morning in Nantucket, Christy's car lost control on a slick coastal road. The accident left her with severe brain trauma. She survived, but doctors warned Arthur her recovery was uncertain. That weekend marked the end of the life they had built together, and the start of a long, painful chapter neither of them could have expected. After the accident in Nantucket, Christy was flown by helicopter to Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. Arthur was at her side within hours, refusing to leave even when urged by doctors to rest. The hospital's corridors, usually filled with routine medical chatter, became a waiting ground for Arthur and his staff. Friends and family flew in from New York, shocked at how quickly life had shifted. Christy had suffered significant brain injury. Though her heart was strong and her body had survived the crash, her consciousness slipped into silence. Arthur approved every possible test, CT scans, MRIs, and consultations with leading neurologists. He had the resources to call specialists from across the United States and Europe, but each one returned with the same grim message. Recovery, if it happened, would take time, and there was no guarantee. For the first year, Arthur held on to hope. He brought her to rehabilitation centers in Chicago and later to a private facility in Zurich, Switzerland, known for its advanced neurological care. Every small flicker of movement was treated as a sign of progress. Arthur hired speech therapists, physical therapists, and nurses to work with her around the clock. For a while, it seemed possible she might improve. But as months turned into years, the progress slowed. Christy never woke, never spoke, and her once bright eyes remained closed to the world. Arthur kept her comfortable, creating a private wing in their Manhattan townhouse where she could receive 24-hour care. He insisted her room overlook Central Park, a place she had loved to walk before the accident. Life outside continued to move forward. The skyline changed, technology advanced, and businesses grew, but Christy remained frozen in time. Arthur threw himself deeper into work, expanding Hendricks Global into renewable energy in California and luxury real estate in Chicago. Yet, no matter how far his success reached, he returned home to the same stillness each night. The love of his life lay silent, and no amount of wealth could bring her back. Over the years, Christy's absence grew heavier for those who once knew her. Friends who had shared dinner tables at Lincoln Center galas or visited her at their summer home in Martha's Vineyard found it painful to see her motionless. Visits became fewer, and eventually, only a close circle remained in touch with Arthur. Arthur, however, never gave up. He maintained her wardrobe, ensuring the nurses dressed her in clothing she would have chosen: simple silk gowns, soft shawls, and her favorite pearl earrings on special occasions. He instructed the staff to keep fresh flowers from the New York Botanical Garden in her room, believing the scent of roses and lilies might one day stir her senses. The townhouse itself, though large and filled with priceless art, felt more like a quiet hospital than a home. Christy's parents, now elderly, visited when they could. They held her hand, spoke softly, and told her about family events she had missed: cousins getting married, nieces and nephews graduating, new babies being born. Each time they left, their hearts grew heavier, uncertain if she had heard them at all. As the second decade approached, Arthur faced a truth he never wanted to admit. Time was moving forward without Christy. He had grown older. His once dark hair was now touched with gray, and the lines on his face deepened from stress and sorrow. Yet every night, before resting, he would sit beside her bed, read a passage from her favorite poetry book, and whisper that he was still waiting for her to come back. By then, few believed she would ever open her eyes again. The Hendricks name remained powerful in business, but the story of Christy had become a quiet tragedy known only to those closest to the family. She was the wife who had everything: beauty, wealth, and love, yet lived 2 decades in silence, with no one expecting the extraordinary turn that lay ahead. For most of New York City, life moved forward. Times Square brightened with new billboards, Wall Street adjusted to market crashes and rebounds, and neighborhoods like Brooklyn Heights and Soho transformed into hubs of culture and style. But inside the Hendricks townhouse near Central Park, time seemed frozen. Christy remained in her hospital bed, her breathing steady, but her eyes closed. Machines softly monitored her heart rate, and nurses moved quietly through the hallways. The world outside might have been racing toward the future, but within those walls, every day looked the same. Arthur tried to keep life as normal as possible. He attended business meetings downtown, traveled to Washington, D.C. for policy discussions, and even flew to London and Paris to maintain the company's international ties. Yet, no matter where he went, his evenings ended in the same place, seated beside Christy, reading to her as if she might suddenly stir. Some doctors encouraged him to accept reality. They spoke carefully, explaining that the odds of recovery after so many years were slim. A few even advised moving her permanently to a long-term care facility. Arthur always refused. To him, the townhouse was Christy's home, and she deserved dignity, not abandonment. While Christy's condition remained unchanged, the world around her shifted in ways she could not see. Her daughter, Emily, who had been only 5 when the accident happened, grew into a teenager. She attended the Burleigh School on Manhattan's Upper East Side, walking past Christy's room every morning before heading to class. At first, Emily would sit with her mother, holding her hand and whispering about school projects, friends, and even the small dramas of growing up. But as the years passed, those visits became shorter. She still loved her mother deeply, but she also carried a quiet pain. The woman who should have guided her through adolescence could only listen in silence. Arthur carried this double weight, running an empire while being both father and mother to Emily. At corporate dinners, people admired his strength. Yet, When he returned to his office overlooking Central Park, the truth set in. His life had been split in half. One part still thriving in the business world, the other anchored by a hospital bed in his home. Despite all this, he never spoke of giving up. He funded research at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, sponsored studies at Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, and consulted specialists from Zurich to Tokyo. No matter how discouraging the reports, Arthur clung to hope, believing that medicine might one day find an answer. By the time Christy had been in her coma for nearly 15 years, the Hendricks name had become even more powerful. Arthur's real estate company expanded across Los Angeles, Miami, and even London's financial district. Yet, for all his success, his private life remained heavy with loneliness. In the townhouse, new staff came and went. Chefs, nurses, assistants. Many worked for a time before moving on. But one person who stayed was Maria, the housemaid originally from El Paso, Texas. She had arrived when Emily was just a child, and over the years became more like family than an employee. Maria often managed the household quietly, ensuring Christy's room was spotless, her linens fresh, and her surroundings calm. Maria's son, Joseph, grew up alongside Emily, though their lives were vastly different. While Emily attended elite schools and summer programs in Boston and Washington, Joseph studied at public schools in Queens. Still, he often visited his mother in the townhouse, sometimes sitting in the kitchen to finish his homework while she worked. Joseph never forgot his earliest memories of Christy. He remembered walking past her room as a boy, asking his mother why the sleeping lady never woke up. As he grew older, his curiosity never faded. Unlike many, on Christy's 20th year in silence, the townhouse had taken on a rhythm that seemed unbreakable. Nurses rotated shifts, Maria ensured everything ran smoothly, and Arthur balanced his empire with his private grief. Emily, now a grown woman studying at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts, often returned on weekends but rarely lingered near her mother's bedside. It was too painful, and she admitted to herself that she no longer believed in miracles. Joseph, however, was different. By now, he was 19 and studying computer engineering at City College of New York. He still visited his mother during breaks, and each time, he made it a point to check on Christy. He would sit beside her bed, sometimes placing his textbooks on the small side table, explaining the concepts he was learning, algorithms, coding, circuits, as if she were his study partner. There was no medical proof that Christy could hear him, but Joseph felt a connection. He refused to treat her as though she were gone. To him, she wasn't a patient in a permanent sleep. She was a person waiting for someone to believe in her. That quiet persistence, those conversations others dismissed as pointless, would soon spark the turning point no one expected. Joseph's bond with Christy wasn't something that happened overnight. It grew quietly, shaped by years of observation and a sense of compassion that went beyond his age. While many in the townhouse treated Christy's condition as part of the background of their work, Joseph refused to let her fade into silence. When he was younger, he often sat in her room while Maria folded laundry. He would talk about school projects, the books he was reading, or even his frustrations with exams. As he got older, those conversations became more intentional. He would share stories about the city, how the subway broke down on his way to class, how he saw street performers at Union Square, or how Central Park felt alive in the spring. Unlike the doctors, who measured Christy's life only through medical charts, Joseph treated her as if she were still present. He would place fresh flowers on the small dresser near her bed, sometimes picking them up from a street vendor outside Columbia University when he visited friends. He spoke to her with respect, never rushing, never mocking. His presence became so consistent that even Arthur began to notice. One evening, Arthur stopped at the doorway and saw Joseph reading aloud from a novel, his voice steady, his tone gentle. It struck Arthur that this young man had become the only person who still believed Christy might somehow hear. Joseph's visits often stretched late into the evening. After finishing his college assignments, he would quietly step into Christy's room with his laptop, pulling up medical research articles he had found online. Though he wasn't a doctor, he was fascinated by the science of the human brain. He read about cases of long-term coma patients, brain stimulation therapies, and experimental treatments being tested in research centers across the United States. He would explain these findings aloud, simplifying the complicated terms as though Christy were his study partner. "Some doctors at Stanford are testing sound therapy," he once said, his voice low but firm. "They believe that familiar voices or music can spark brain activity. Maybe that's why I keep talking to you. Maybe, one day, something I say will reach you." Nurses passing by sometimes smiled at his determination. A few even admitted privately that Christy's room felt warmer when Joseph was there. Unlike others who came and went quickly, Joseph lingered, filling the silence with words, laughter, and hope. Maria often watched from the doorway, deeply moved. She had raised Joseph to respect every human life, and now she saw that lesson living in him. Though she never told Arthur directly, she believed Joseph's constant presence was giving Christy something medicine alone could not provide: the will to keep holding on. Over time, Joseph developed a routine that made Christy's room feel less like a hospital space and more like a living part of the home. He brought in music, carefully curating playlists of songs from the 1980s and 1990s, the years when Christy had been young. Whitney Houston, Celine Dion, and Elton John often played softly from his small Bluetooth speaker. He also began reading aloud from Christy's favorite authors. Maria had once mentioned that Christy loved the works of Jane Austen and contemporary American writers like Toni Morrison. So Joseph would sit for hours, reading Pride and Prejudice or Beloved, pausing occasionally to explain passages as though he were in a classroom discussion. On some nights, when the weight of college life and the city pressed heavily on him, Joseph confided in her. He spoke about the pressure of balancing studies with part-time work, about feeling invisible among wealthier classmates, and about his dreams of one day creating technology that could change lives. He trusted her with thoughts he shared with no one else. To outsiders, it might have seemed pointless. But for Joseph, these conversations were real. In those moments, Christy wasn't just a silent figure in a hospital bed. She was a listener, a guardian of his hopes. He believed that deep within her silence, some part of her could feel the life he poured into that room. Arthur began to notice subtle changes whenever Joseph was in the room. Christy's heartbeat sometimes registered slightly higher on the monitor, as though responding to the young man's voice. At first, Arthur dismissed it as coincidence, but after several weeks of seeing the same pattern, he grew curious. One evening, Arthur approached Joseph after finding him adjusting Christy's blanket and softly telling her about a robotics project at school. "Why do you spend so much time here?" Arthur asked, his voice more tired than demanding. Joseph hesitated, then replied honestly. "Because she matters. Everyone talks about her like she's gone, but she's still here. I don't know how to explain it, sir. I just feel she can hear me." Arthur stood silently for a moment, struck by the sincerity in Joseph's tone. He had heard countless doctors give explanations wrapped in medical terms, but Joseph's belief carried no agenda, only faith. For the first time in years, Arthur felt the faint flicker of hope he thought he had lost. Though he didn't say it aloud, Arthur began to trust Joseph. He allowed the young man more access, encouraging him to continue spending time with Christy. Deep down, Arthur wondered if this bond might hold the very key that medicine had failed to unlock. It happened on a quiet Saturday morning in early spring. The city outside was alive with the sounds of traffic, tourists heading toward Central Park, and joggers passing by Fifth Avenue. Inside the Hendricks townhouse, the atmosphere was still, broken only by the faint hum of machines in Christy's room. Joseph sat beside her as usual, a stack of notes resting on the side table. He had been up late working on a programming assignment, and his tired eyes showed it. Still, he leaned forward, speaking gently as he always did. This time, he was telling Christy about a lecture he attended at MIT, where researchers discussed brain-computer interfaces and how new technology could one day help people in comas communicate. As he spoke, he reached out and placed his hand lightly over hers. It was something he had done countless times before, but this time felt different. He thought he felt the faintest twitch under his fingers. His breath caught, and he froze, wondering if exhaustion had played a trick on him. Then it happened again. Christy's fingers moved, small, unsteady, but undeniable. Joseph's heart raced. For 20 years, she had remained motionless, her body unresponsive to every attempt. Now, against all expectations, she had given a sign of life. Joseph leapt to his feet, nearly knocking over his chair. "Mom!" Maria's voice called from the hallway when she heard the noise, rushing into the room. She froze as Joseph pointed at Christy's hand. "She moved," he said breathlessly. Maria's eyes widened, but she didn't waste time doubting. She hurried to Christy's side, gently touching her arm. "Senora Hendricks, it's Maria. If you can hear us, try again." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, just as Joseph had felt before, Christy's fingers twitched once more. Maria gasped and grabbed Joseph's arm. "Go get Mr. Hendricks. Now!" Arthur was in his study, reviewing documents for a meeting in Chicago, when Joseph burst in, his words tumbling over themselves. At first, Arthur struggled to believe him. After so many years of disappointment, hope had become dangerous. But when he entered Christy's room and saw her hand shift slightly under Joseph's, Arthur's knees nearly gave out. The medical team was called immediately. Within minutes, 2 nurses and the family's private physician arrived, checking her vitals and monitoring her responses. They confirmed it wasn't a muscle spasm or involuntary reaction. Christy was responding to touch, something she had not done in 2 decades. For Arthur, Maria, and Joseph, it was the moment that cracked open 20 years of silence. For the first time, Christy was showing the world she was still fighting to return. News of Christy's sudden responses spread quickly among the medical staff. Specialists from Mount Sinai Hospital were contacted, and within hours, a team arrived with advanced equipment to run tests. They recorded her brain activity, measured her reflexes, and carefully observed how she reacted to Joseph's voice compared to others. What stunned them was the pattern. When doctors gave commands, Christy's reactions were minimal, barely noticeable. But when Joseph spoke, her responses grew stronger. Her eyelids fluttered faintly, her fingers gripped more firmly, and her breathing shifted, as though she were trying to focus on his words. Arthur stood at the foot of the bed, overwhelmed. For 2 decades, the greatest minds in medicine had failed to break through to his wife. Yet this young man, the maid's son, had done what no one else could, reach her on a level science could hardly explain. Reporters hadn't yet been alerted, but within the townhouse, the event felt historic. Maria quietly wept in the corner, whispering prayers of thanks. Emily, called home from Harvard, rushed into the room and froze at the sight. She hadn't dared hope for years, but now she stood watching her mother respond, tears streaming down her face. Though Christy had not yet opened her eyes or spoken, the signs were undeniable. The impossible had begun. Over the following weeks, Christy's progress became the focus of everyone's lives. The townhouse, once marked by quiet routine, now carried an air of cautious excitement. Nurses carefully documented each new response, while doctors rotated in and out, eager to witness what they described as one of the rarest recoveries in medical history. Every small step felt monumental. Christy's hand would tighten around Joseph's fingers when he spoke. Her head shifted slightly when he played her favorite music. One evening, while Joseph was reading aloud, her lips parted as if trying to form a word. The entire room froze, holding their breath, before Maria whispered, "She's trying." Arthur could hardly believe it. For 20 years, he had begged science for answers, spent fortunes funding research, and prayed for a miracle. Now that miracle was happening in his own home, led not by a world-renowned neurologist, but by a young man who had refused to stop believing. The doctors remained cautious. They explained that Christy's recovery would be slow and uncertain. Still, the fact that she was responding at all was extraordinary. For the family, however, it was already enough. The impossible had been set in motion, and their lives would never be the same again. Christy's first signs of awakening came slowly, almost shyly, as if her body was relearning how to respond after 2 decades of silence. At first, it was only the faint squeeze of Joseph's hand, small enough that doctors hesitated to call it meaningful. But as days turned into weeks, the signs became harder to dismiss. Her eyes, once closed without interruption, began to flutter more frequently. One afternoon, while Joseph was speaking to her about his college exams, her gaze seemed to shift toward his voice. The nurses leaned in, noting that her eyes tracked the movement of his hand when he lifted it slightly. To anyone else, it might have seemed minor. To Arthur, Joseph, and Maria, it was everything. The medical team knew such progress couldn't be explained away as reflex. They conducted structured tests, flashing lights, sound cues, and tactile prompts to measure her responses. Each time Joseph participated, Christy showed stronger reactions. It was as though her brain had formed a bridge to his voice, bypassing the silence of years. Arthur stood by her bedside one evening and, for the first time in years, allowed himself to cry openly. Not the quiet, restrained tears he had shed in private, but deep sobs that shook his body. Hope, long buried under years of disappointment, was alive again. Within weeks, Christy's progress could no longer be contained inside the townhouse. Arthur arranged for her to be transported under careful supervision to Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, where some of the nation's top neurologists could evaluate her condition. The transfer was quiet, with no press or public announcement. Arthur wanted privacy, not headlines. In Boston, a team of specialists placed Christy through a series of advanced scans. To their astonishment, the results showed renewed brain activity. Areas that had remained dormant for years were now lighting up. Dr. Reynolds, the lead neurologist, addressed Arthur and Joseph after reviewing the data. What we are seeing here is highly unusual. There are very few cases in medical history of such long-term comas showing this kind of response. Something, or someone, has been stimulating her brain in ways we don't fully understand. Arthur immediately looked toward Joseph, who sat quietly in the corner, his head lowered. The doctors wanted to study the interaction more closely, so they conducted controlled sessions. When Joseph spoke, Christy's brain scans showed a measurable rise in activity. When others spoke, the change was minimal. The doctors were cautious in their conclusions, but one thing was certain. Joseph's presence had become central to Christy's progress. For Arthur, the realization was both humbling and extraordinary. A young man who had grown up in the shadows of his household had done what all the money in the world could not. He had reached Christy where science had failed. Christy's therapy sessions in Boston became the center of daily life for the family. Joseph traveled with Arthur and Maria, often sitting through long hours in the hospital as specialists ran tests. The sessions were simple at first, flashing pictures, playing familiar sounds, asking yes or no questions that required her to squeeze Joseph's hand. To everyone's amazement, Christy began responding consistently. When Joseph asked, "Do you hear me?" her fingers tightened around his hand. When Arthur tried the same, the response was weaker but still present. The doctors logged everything carefully, noting patterns, adjusting techniques, and planning the next stages of stimulation. Arthur struggled with a mix of relief and guilt. For years, he had trusted only in cutting-edge research and world-class physicians, overlooking the possibility that human connection could be the missing key. Watching Joseph, he realized that what Christy needed wasn't just medicine, it was presence. Someone had refused to give up on her, and that faith had carried weight no scan could measure. At night, Arthur often walked along the Charles River near the hospital, reflecting on how much had changed. He had spent billions to expand his company across continents, but the most valuable discovery of his life came not from wealth or influence, but from a college student who had shown extraordinary compassion. The family began to feel a cautious optimism. For the first time in 20 years, the Hendricks home carried a sense of anticipation. Christy was coming back. The day Christy first opened her eyes was quiet, almost unremarkable to anyone outside the hospital. Joseph was seated by her bed, reading aloud from one of her favorite novels, while Arthur and Maria sat nearby. Suddenly, Joseph noticed her eyelids flutter more steadily than before. This time, instead of falling back into stillness, they lifted, slowly, hesitantly, revealing tired but living eyes. Maria gasped and clasped her hands to her mouth. Arthur froze, tears welling instantly. Joseph leaned forward, his voice trembling. "Mrs. Hendricks. Christy, can you see me?" Her gaze shifted weakly toward him. Though she could not yet speak, the recognition in her eyes was unmistakable. For the first time in 20 years, she was no longer hidden behind silence. Doctors rushed in, confirming what the family already knew. Christy was awakening. They explained that her recovery would be fragile and gradual, requiring constant care and therapy. But to Arthur, Maria, Emily, who had flown in from Harvard that very night, and especially Joseph, the miracle was already complete. Arthur knelt beside her bed, pressing his forehead against her hand as tears streamed down his face. For 2 decades, hope had been buried under doubt. Now it had returned with undeniable force. The impossible had happened. Christy Hendricks was awake. Christy's awakening was only the beginning of a long and demanding journey. Though her eyes opened and her awareness returned, her body carried the weight of 2 decades of stillness. Muscles had weakened, coordination was nearly lost, and speech felt like an unreachable mountain. Yet the spark of determination in her eyes pushed everyone around her to believe she could climb that mountain, step by step. The hospital arranged an intensive program. Each morning, Christy was guided through physical therapy sessions designed to strengthen her limbs. At first, even sitting upright required immense effort. Joseph often stood behind her, lending gentle support with a hand on her shoulder. The therapists encouraged tiny victories, lifting her arm, holding a spoon, pressing her foot against the ground. Arthur rarely missed a session. Watching his wife struggle yet persist broke him open in new ways. Once the magnate of boardrooms and authority, he now sat quietly, clapping softly when Christy managed the smallest gesture. Maria, ever the steady nurse, provided encouragement while ensuring her patient was never pushed too far. But it was Joseph's presence that fueled her most. He read to her, sang to her, and sometimes simply sat in silence, allowing her to draw strength from his nearness. During speech therapy, when Christy first managed to form a faint sound, it was Joseph's name she attempted to say. The syllables were broken, strained, but unmistakable. He wept openly, holding her trembling hand against his cheek. Progress came in uneven strides. Some days, Christy seemed to advance quickly, managing to form short words or take supported steps with the help of parallel bars. On other days, fatigue set in so heavily that she could barely lift her hand. The therapists reminded everyone that recovery was not a straight road, but a journey that demanded patience. Arthur struggled with this more than anyone. Accustomed to control and immediate results in business, he found himself powerless when Christy's body resisted improvement. There were moments when frustration almost overwhelmed him, but Joseph's calm steadiness often softened the edges. "She's fighting," Joseph would remind him. "Even if it's slow, every breath, every movement is a win." Maria remained the quiet backbone of the household, ensuring Christy had consistency in her care. She adjusted meal plans, coordinated therapy schedules, and even played gentle background music during exercises to ease Christy's tension. The bond between the 2 women deepened, not through words, but through shared smiles and trust. Outside the hospital walls, whispers of Christy's awakening began to spread. Neighbors, friends, and eventually the media became curious about the woman who had returned to consciousness after 20 silent years. Reporters tried to reach the family, but Arthur firmly shielded Christy's privacy. He knew she wasn't ready to face cameras or questions. Her world needed to remain small, safe, and nurturing. Through it all, Joseph's role as her anchor only grew. In moments when frustration threatened to overwhelm Christy, he steadied her with patience. He reminded her that every syllable she spoke and every shaky step was proof of her strength, not her weakness. Months passed, and Christy's progress became more noticeable. She could now form full sentences, though sometimes her speech came haltingly. The first time she whispered, "Thank you," while holding Joseph's hand, the room fell silent. Arthur wept openly, realizing that his daughter's voice, once thought lost forever, had returned. Walking was harder. Christy relied on therapists, crutches, and sheer determination to take a few steps each day. Each movement carried the weight of 20 lost years, but also the joy of rediscovery. Joseph often walked alongside her, letting her grip his arm for balance. "One step at a time," he would say, and she would nod, repeating the words softly as if turning them into her own mantra. Arthur, humbled by her struggle, shifted his role from provider to presence. He began attending every session, no longer distracted by business calls or board meetings. For the first time in decades, he was simply a father, cheering at small victories and wiping away tears when setbacks came. Maria brought stability through her quiet devotion. She often read to Christy during rest breaks, choosing stories about resilience and hope. The familiar rhythm of her voice soothed Christy, reminding her that she was not alone. Though the outside world pressed for details, the family remained guarded. The story of Christy's awakening might have inspired millions, but Arthur insisted her healing came before publicity. Within the walls of their home and therapy centers, her story was not one of spectacle, but of survival, care, and the slow rebuilding of a life. As Christy's strength returned, so did moments of deep frustration. She sometimes broke down in tears when her hands trembled too much to hold a spoon, or when her legs refused to cooperate after hours of effort. Joseph would sit beside her, patiently guiding her fingers or coaxing her into laughter with his harmonica. "We'll get there," he'd remind her. His steady presence gave her courage to keep trying. Arthur, once defined by his empire and responsibilities, began to see life differently. Board meetings could wait. Shareholders could wait. What mattered was sitting beside his daughter as she practiced new words, or watching her smile faintly when Joseph played her favorite tune. For him, each day became a second chance to be the father he hadn't been during her youth. The Hendricks estate, once quiet and formal, slowly filled with warmth again. The staff cheered at Christy's milestones, from her first spoonful of food without help to the shaky steps she managed across the living room. Even Maria, who had held the family together for decades, confessed she had almost lost hope before Joseph's music changed everything. Doctors from Boston and New York continued to monitor her, often remarking how rare her case was. Yet they admitted science alone couldn't explain why she had come back. The family, however, didn't need explanations. For them, Christy's slow recovery was proof that patience, love, and compassion could achieve what machines and medicine alone could not. By the end of the second year, Christy was walking short distances unaided, speaking clearly, and even sharing jokes again. She was not the same as before her coma, but in many ways she was stronger, and so was everyone around her. Returning fully to the world after 20 years was both overwhelming and extraordinary for Christy. The first time she stepped outside the Hendricks estate on her own, she clutched Joseph's arm tightly, staring at the rows of cars streaming down Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. The city she once knew had changed in ways she could hardly grasp. Towering electronic billboards lit up the skyline. Taxis had been joined by sleek black rideshare vehicles, and almost everyone seemed glued to a small device in their hands. Technology fascinated and confused her. Arthur bought her the latest iPhone, but it took Joseph hours of patient teaching before she could send her first text. "This is like magic," she laughed softly when a message pinged back instantly. Social media felt even stranger. She had no profile, no presence online, while people her age had decades of digital history. At times, she admitted she felt like a ghost who had missed entire chapters of the world's story. Yet amid the adjustments, Christy clung to small joys. She rediscovered her love for books, spending hours in the New York Public Library on Fifth Avenue. Maria often accompanied her, carrying stacks of novels home for her to enjoy. Music became another lifeline. Joseph's harmonica evolved into evening sessions where they listened to old jazz records together, filling the house with warmth that no machine could replicate. Through it all, Christy marveled not only at how much had changed, but at how much had endured. Kindness, music, family. These constants gave her strength as she began to shape a life that was no longer defined by what she had lost, but by what she was slowly learning to embrace again. Christy's connection with Joseph grew deeper each passing week. She often called him her lifeline, not only because his music had sparked her awakening, but because his kindness reminded her of the humanity she thought she had lost in the Coma years. At family dinners, she insisted he sit beside her, laughing at his quick humor and encouraging him to talk about his dreams. Joseph, though still young, carried wisdom beyond his years. He spoke about wanting to study medicine, inspired by the doctors who had cared for Christy and by the miracle he had witnessed firsthand. Arthur was so moved that he quietly began arranging scholarships and introductions, though Joseph never asked for help. For him, the bond with Christy was enough. He simply wanted to see her thrive. Exploring the city became part of Christy's therapy. She and Joseph walked through Central Park, where she marveled at children playing with drones and tourists snapping selfies with rented bikes. On weekends, Arthur arranged small outings to places she had once loved. Lincoln Center for a symphony, or a quiet corner cafe where jazz musicians still played late into the night. Each outing gave her a chance to rediscover not just the city, but herself. Despite the joy, there were moments of grief. She realized she had missed entire milestones. Friends had married, had children, and grown older without her. The world had moved forward while she slept. Some days, the weight of those lost years pressed hard, but Joseph's gentle presence reminded her that life wasn't measured only by what was gone. It was also about what could still be created. One of Christy's greatest joys was rediscovering the simple things. She would sit for hours in Bryant Park with Joseph, sipping tea and watching people move about their lives. The sound of street performers, violinists, singers, even breakdancers, filled her with awe. "I never realized how alive New York feels until now," she whispered one afternoon, smiling as Joseph handed her roasted chestnuts from a vendor's cart. At home, she embraced small routines that gave her independence. She relearned how to cook simple meals, sometimes insisting on preparing breakfast for everyone even if Maria still hovered protectively nearby. Reading became her quiet escape. She devoured classics she had once loved, but also explored modern authors whose works had been written while she slept. "It's like meeting a world I missed but was waiting for me," she said while flipping through a new novel. Evenings were sacred. Christy often asked Joseph to play the harmonica while Arthur sat quietly nearby. The music had become a symbol of everything they had endured and overcome. Sometimes Christy hummed along. Other times she simply closed her eyes and let the notes wash over her, grateful for the second life she had been given. She also found comfort in moments of reflection. Sitting on a bench in Central Park, she confessed to Joseph that waking up after 20 years felt like carrying two lives inside her, the young woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. Instead of despairing over the gap, she chose to see it as a rare gift, a reminder that life was fragile, but also capable of renewal in ways no one could predict. Christy's journey offered lessons far beyond her family's circle. For many who heard her story, the first and most powerful reminder was that persistence and compassion can reach places science cannot. For 2 decades, machines and medicine kept her alive, yet it was Joseph's music and the daily presence of those who cared that sparked her return. The lesson is simple. Never underestimate the power of steady kindness. Every small act mattered. Joseph's harmonica, Maria's steady prayers, Arthur's renewed devotion. None of these were medical breakthroughs, but they created an atmosphere that gave Christy a reason to respond. It reminds us that healing is often a partnership between science and the human spirit. Doctors can provide tools, but it is love, patience, and connection that keep those tools meaningful. The second lesson comes from Joseph himself. He was not wealthy, powerful, or highly educated at the time. He was simply a boy with a heart open enough to believe his music could matter. His actions remind us that it doesn't take status or riches to change a life. Often, it is the people we least expect who bring about the most extraordinary change. Christy later admitted that during her slow recovery, she sometimes thought of giving up. But she said Joseph's quiet persistence, showing up each day with music and encouragement, taught her something essential. Hope is not a grand gesture, but the consistent presence of care. For anyone listening to her story, this is a call to never dismiss the power of small, faithful acts. Another powerful lesson from Christy's journey was the truth about wealth and its limits. Arthur Hendricks had every resource at his disposal. Access to the best hospitals in Boston and New York, teams of specialists, state-of-the-art equipment. Yet for 20 years, none of it had awakened his daughter. It was humbling for him to realize that while money could sustain her physically, it could not give her the spark of life she needed to return. This realization carries weight for anyone listening. Wealth is useful, but it is not the ultimate source of healing or happiness. Too often, people measure success by possessions, properties, or influence, but Christy's awakening showed that the most priceless gifts, compassion, patience, love, cannot be bought. Joseph, who had none of the privileges of Arthur's world, provided what billions of dollars could not: a personal connection that reached Christy's heart. Christy herself spoke about this when she was strong enough to address her family. She told Arthur, "Your money gave me doctors, but Joseph gave me a reason to fight." That statement not only shook her father, but became a reminder to all who heard it. Relationships hold a power greater than any fortune. For viewers, the lesson is clear. If you have resources, use them wisely, but do not forget that the true value of life lies in the bonds you nurture. Whether it's family, friends, or even unexpected strangers, human connection is often the greatest medicine of all. Christy's recovery also highlights that healing is not about returning to the past, but about embracing new beginnings. For 20 years, her life was paused. When she awoke, she could not reclaim the years that had passed. Friends had grown older, society had changed, and even her own body no longer responded the way it once had. Yet instead of drowning in regret, she chose to focus on what she could build in the present. This is a lesson many people struggle with: the tendency to dwell on lost opportunities or wasted time. Christy's journey shows that while we cannot rewind life, we can shape the future with the time we have now. She once told Joseph during a walk in Central Park, "I don't want to chase what I missed. I want to create what's left." That statement became a guiding truth for her recovery. Her bond with Joseph made this lesson even more powerful. Their relationship was not tied to the years she had lost, but to the new life she was building. Each moment of laughter, each step she took while holding his arm, was proof that joy could still be found. For anyone facing setbacks, whether through illness, failure, or loss, Christy's perspective is a reminder that life's value lies in what we choose to do with today. The past may be unchangeable, but tomorrow remains full of possibility. In the end, Christy's story teaches us that no act of kindness is ever wasted. It was not a groundbreaking medical procedure or a sudden miracle that brought her back, but the steady rhythm of love, a boy's harmonica, a maid's faithful care, and a father's rediscovered devotion. Each act of compassion, no matter how small, built a bridge that carried her from silence back into life. Her journey also reminds us of the resilience of the human spirit. Christy did not return to the world as the same young woman she once was. She returned wiser, grateful, and more aware of how fragile time can be. Instead of dwelling on the years she had missed, she learned to cherish the ones she had been given. One evening, months after regaining her strength, Christy sat with Joseph on a bench overlooking the New York skyline. He played his harmonica softly while the sun dipped behind the tall buildings. Listening, Christy whispered, "This is what life is, finding beauty in the moment we have." For her family, and for anyone who hears her story, those words carry a lasting truth. Christy's story reminds us that no act of kindness is too small, and sometimes hope arrives from the least expected place. Would you have believed this story if you hadn't heard it today? Share your thoughts, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for tomorrow's story. Your support helps us keep bringing powerful, true-to-life stories that inspire the world.